Welcome to Argynweld Palace, my friends. Within these cold, damp halls, time does not move as it does in the outside world. Oh no, my friends. Here time is a prisoner, held fast by ancient magic, bending to the will of those who dwell here. In the winter of 1574, the northern lands of Europe lay under a shroud of silver frost, and inside the thick stone walls of Argynweld, the hearths blazed like the hearts of ancient giants. That year a great feast was declared, a celebration of the union between the two most powerful houses in the realm. None of the invited guests knew they were walking into a masquerade from which no door would open once the night began. Our host is Duke Albrecht von Hohenfeld, a man with eyes as blue and deep as a winter lake, and a smile impossible to decipher. Was it kindness or pity? He had lived through wars, had witnessed both nights of roaring triumph and days of unspeakable ruin. Whenever he entered a room, he carried with him an unspoken weight, as though a shadow moved just behind his shoulders. Tonight that shadow was waiting to be revealed. The great hall glittered in the glow of countless candles. Crystal chandeliers hung in clouds of wine-scented air, their prisms scattering shards of light over velvet gowns and gold-threaded tunics. The banquet table was a cathedral of indulgence, venison roasted to golden perfection, river salmon perfumed with herbs, loaves of bread so warm they seemed to breathe, ruby wine-filled glasses so thin they trembled with every touch. Nobles from far corners of the kingdom gathered, cloaked in mink and ermine, their jewels catching the firelight. They believed they were part of history's grand theater, each imagining themselves the leading player in this splendid act. But how many of them would remember their entrance when the curtain fell? Yet for those who paid attention, there were peculiarities. The windows were sealed shut, though the hall was stifling. Guards were not stationed at the doors, but scattered among the guests, watching with an unnatural stillness. And at the head of the table, a row of empty chairs waited, unclaimed and unoffered. Then, in a shadowed corner, sat a woman in a black velvet mantle. No one knew her name or whence she came. Her eyes gleamed like polished silver, and her voice, when she spoke at all, was low, curling like smoke. She neither ate nor drank, only tilted her head now and then, as if listening to a music unheard by others. Those who accidentally met her gaze found a chill crawling down their spine. Outside, the moon climbed higher, a silent witness to the growing unease within. The night unrolled itself to the sound of lutes and viols, weaving a slow, hypnotic melody. It was a music that did not soothe, but seemed to probe the hidden recesses of the mind. Laughter rang out, hollow and forced, growing louder as the hours crept by. Each jest, each story told, each toast raised, echoed in the vast emptiness behind the closed doors. For they were not in a hall of revelry, but within the belly of a beast, feasting on their false merriment. Last the Duke rose, lifting his glass in a toast. He spoke of peace, of prosperity, yet his words came measured, as though he were delaying some inevitable moment. When the guests sipped their wine, a strange awareness settled in the room. They were trapped, and the realization, sweet like poison, spread through their veins. Then, from nowhere, a bell tolled. Not the bright ring of the palace clock, but a low resonant sound, as though drawn up from the earth's deep chambers. Musicians stopped. Silence spread like a shadow over the hall. And it was only when the great doors began to close, their iron locks falling into place with a sound of final to mistake, that the guests began to understand. This would not be a feast like any they had ever known. They struggled against the closing doors, but their hands met only solid iron. Screams echoed in the vast hall as the darkness around them deepened. Some sank to their knees. Others collapsed against the wall, their faces pale masks in the flickering candlelight. A few managed to claw at the heavy oak, their fingernails leaving bloody smears on its surface, but to no avail. And as the last sliver of hope flickered and died, their eyes met the Duke's. His lips curved into a triumphant smile, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp, a little too long. Behind him, the woman in black stirred, a wisp of a smile touching her lips. The feast had begun. In the grand hall of Castle Oberon, a peculiar scene unfolds. Amidst the revelry of a high society party celebrating an arranged marriage between two noble houses, an air of disquiet is palpable. The celebration, orchestrated by the enigmatic Duke Albrecht, takes a bizarre turn when he abruptly excuses himself to the bathroom. What began as whispers soon grew into uneasy murmurs. At first, the guests had dismissed it as nothing. Apt precaution, perhaps. A quirk of the Duke's eccentricity. Yet, unease spread, invisible but relentless, weaving itself into the laughter, dulling the music that had not yet returned. Conversations faltered. The candles, though steady, seemed to cast deeper shadows than before. Duke Albrecht, the host of the gathering, resumes his seat with a calm, too deliberate to be natural. He offers polite nods to those who address him, yet his gaze lingers on the black-clad woman in the corner, as if the two share an understanding that excludes everyone else in the hall. She, in turn, simply watches, her hands folded, her face unreadable, her eyes reflecting the firelight like coins at the bottom of a dark well. Servant enters, silent as a phantom, bearing a covered silver platter. He sets it before the Duke, who with a slow, deliberate motion lifts the lid. A warm, aromatic steam curls into the air, carrying a scent that is neither entirely pleasant nor entirely foreign. Whatever it is, it draws the attention of every guest, not because of the dish itself, but because of the strange stillness with which the Duke regards it. He does not eat. Instead, he turns to his steward and murmurs something too low to hear. The steward nods, and as if on cue, the guards positioned among the guests shift slightly, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. The movement is small, but it is enough to set a shiver running through the hall. Then the Duke rises again, glass in hand. "My friends," he begins, his voice warm but edged with steel. "You have traveled far to stand under this roof. Tonight, we celebrate more than an alliance of names. Tonight, we honor a covenant sealed long before we were born, one that has kept this land safe from the hunger that lies beyond the walls of our world." The guests exchange puzzled glances. No one dares interrupt, yet the air seems to thicken with questions unasked. "You may have heard the stories," he continues, pacing slowly before the table. "Old tales told by firelight, of the winter that lasted 3 years, of the silence that fell upon the forests, of the nights when no bird sang and no dawn came. Most dismiss them as legends. But legends," he pauses, looking over the assembly, "have roots deeper than truth itself." The faintest smile touches the lips of the black-clad woman. It is almost imperceptible. To keep the darkness at bay, the Duke says, his tone lowering, "A promise was made. A feast held every quarter-century. Guests of honor, chosen not for their titles, but for their significance. And tonight, my friends, you are those guests." For a heartbeat, no one speaks. The words seem to hang in the air like frost. Then, somewhere down the table, a nervous laugh breaks the silence, but it dies quickly when the great doors at the far end swing open once more. From the darkness beyond, a procession enters. Figures draped in crimson robes, their faces hidden by gilded masks. They move in perfect unison, carrying tall, unlit candles. As they pass, the air grows colder, and the scent of beeswax and something older, something earthen, fills the hall. They stop before the empty chairs at the head of the table. Without a word, they place their candles upon the table and stand motionless. The Duke returns to his seat, and for a moment, the hall seems to hold its breath. "Now," he says softly, almost to himself, "let the feast truly begin." As the chilling narrative unfolds, the atmosphere thickens, mirroring the mounting dread among the guests. The Duke's cryptic speech and the sudden entrance of the robed figures introduce an eerie, otherworldly element to the story, suggesting that the true purpose of the gathering goes beyond a simple alliance. And with that, the unsettling feast under the shadow of ancient covenants begins, leaving the true nature of the gathering and the identities of these peculiar guests shrouded in mystery. Patrons, thank you so much for clicking on this video. If you're new here, welcome to my channel where I bring you new original horror stories every week. And if you're a returning viewer, thank you for continuing to support me. I wouldn't be here without you. And now on to the story. The music returned, but it was no longer the lively weave of lutes and viols from before. Instead, a slow, minor key dirge unfurled through the hall. Each note lingered like a shadow that refused to lift. The crimson-robed figures remained still, their masked faces turned toward the table, their eyes. If there were eyes behind those masks, hidden in darkness, the guests tried to resume their merriment. They lifted forks, tasted morsels of roasted pheasant and honeyed apples, sipped wine, yet the flavors seemed muted, as if the air itself had dulled their tongues. Conversations became hushed, sentences cut short by glances toward the guards, who now stood closer, their presence no longer an afterthought, but a constant, looming reminder. Near the center of the table, a young countess named Isolde sat rigid. She had traveled 3 days through snow and wind to attend this feast, her invitation marked with the Duke's personal seal, a rare honor. She could not shake the feeling that the seal had been less an invitation than a summons. Across from her, an elderly baron shifted in his chair. "It's rather warm in here, don't you think?" he muttered, tugging at his collar. The remark was harmless, but it drew the attention of one of the guards, who stepped closer. The baron fell silent. At the head of the table, the Duke leaned back, his eyes sweeping over the guests like a painter surveying a half-finished canvas. The black-clad woman had not moved. Her stillness was absolute, as though she had been carved from the same stone as the palace itself. The crimson-robed figures began to hum, a low, droning note that seemed to seep into the bones. It was not a melody, not even a chant, but something older, something that vibrated in the very air. The candles on the table flickered in unison, though no wind stirred. Then came the faintest sound, a click, almost like the turning of a key. Isolde glanced toward the doors and saw that the locks, already fastened, had been reinforced by iron bars lowered into place. She swallowed, feeling her heartbeat quicken. The Duke's voice cut through the hum. "The covenant demands witness," he said. "To sit at this table is to be bound by what transpires here." To leave before the final course, he let the words trail off, as if their end were too impolite to speak aloud. The humming deepened. One of the robed figures lit their candle, then passed the flame to the next, and the next, until all stood holding flickering lights. The shadows they cast twisted along the walls, stretching into shapes that seemed almost human, almost moving. Isolde's gaze met the black-clad woman's for a moment, and she felt something cold and ancient press against her thoughts. Not words, not images, but a presence. She tore her eyes away, only to find the Duke watching her with that same unreadable smile. Plates were cleared, new dishes arrived, steaming bowls covered by silver domes. The servants placed them carefully, yet none of the guests reached for their spoons. The scent that rose was unlike anything in the earlier courses. Richer, darker, carrying with it a faint metallic temps that made the back of the throat tighten. Somewhere far above, in the unseen rafters, a single drop of water fell, striking the marble floor with a sound that echoed far longer than it should have. No one spoke. "To the pact," he murmured, and tasted the first bite. The Duke's spoon touched the silver bowl with a sound that rang far louder than it should have in the hush. He swallowed slowly, his gaze fixed not on his food, but on the assembly before him. One by one, the guests hesitated, then lifted their own spoons. As if compelled by something greater than courtesy, the first mouthful was tentative. The second, slower still. No one could name the taste. It was rich and heavy, and it left behind a warmth that spread unnaturally fast through the body. The crimson-robed figures began to move. They walked the length of the hall, the flames in their hands drawing strange shapes on the walls, shapes that seemed almost to lean closer, listening. The hum that had haunted the room deepened into something like a heartbeat, steady and inescapable. At the center of the table, Countess Isolde's hands trembled as she set down her spoon. The warmth in her chest was no longer pleasant. It felt like a pulse that did not belong to her own heart. Her vision blurred at the edges, and in the wavering candlelight. The faces of the other guests seemed subtly changed, their eyes darker, their skin drawn tighter, as though the life within them were being measured. The Duke rose once more, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the marble floor. "You have honored the pact," he said softly, "and in so doing, you have given the kingdom another 25 years of light." His words were not triumphant, but solemn, as if this act were as much a burden to him as it was to them. The black-clad woman stood. The room seemed to bend around her, the air thickening as she moved toward the empty chairs at the head of the table. The crimson-robed figures parted for her without a word. She took her place in the very center, her hands resting lightly on the table as she looked upon the guests. Her voice was soft, yet it carried to every corner of the hall. "You have dined," she said. "You have shared in the covenant. When the candles burn down, you will depart. But not all of you." A ripple of shock passed through the table. Someone tried to stand, but a guard's hand pressed firmly on their shoulder. The humming returned, louder now, until it seemed to come from within the walls themselves. The woman's silver-bright eyes swept the assembly. "The darkness waits beyond the gates," she murmured. "It will not cross while the pact is kept. But the pact requires keeper." From somewhere unseen, a second set of bells began to toll, each note deeper than the last. The crimson-robed figures stepped forward, and for the first time, their masks tilted upward, revealing nothing but shadow beneath. The Duke's expression was unreadable, but his voice was clear. "The keeper remains here, within these walls. The rest return to your lands, untouched by what lies outside." For now, the candles burned lower. The hum softened to silence. One by one, the guests were led from the hall, their faces pale, their steps unsteady. Countess Isolde felt a hand on her arm, gentle but firm, and realized with a sinking dread that she was not among those being guided toward the doors. The last thing she saw before the great doors closed was the Duke, standing beside the black-clad woman, both watching her with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of memory. And as the lock turned, sealing her inside, she understood at last. The feast was not an ending, but the beginning of her part in a story that would never be told beyond these walls.